So Doug, tell me why a circuit breaker would trip.
There's several different reasons why a breaker may trip, but it's usually because of the overcurrent device that's on the circuit breaker. And you could have a phase to ground fault. You could have an inrush from like a motor that's going to make it trip, or you might just have someone in the control room that pushes a button that says trip the breaker, and the shunt trip and the breaker will open the breaker.
Basically, there's three common reasons why a circuit breaker would trip. A circuit breaker can experience a current event, like a fault, downstream of the circuit breaker, which would cause it to open and actually trip. The second would be an external device operated the circuit breaker's shunt trip device and opened the breaker. And the third would be a mechanical interlock that possibly failed or was operated and caused the breaker to open. So the first of those, the current event, is really the only thing that can be considered a true trip on the circuit breaker. And trips on a circuit breaker have, a couple of different reasons for tripping. An overload, referred to as long time delay trip, is usually reserved for a breaker that has exceeded its maximum capacity for a certain period of time, and that's usually a longer trip. The second type is a short circuit type of trip, or it's also called instantaneous or short time delay, depending on the magnitude of the current. And those are usually phase-to-phase type events that happen very fast, that are very violent, and produce a lot of heat and current at the same time, and cause the breaker to interrupt extremely rapidly. You also have a phase to ground fault, which is referred to as a ground fault. And a ground fault is when a phase has gone to ground and doesn't necessarily involve the other phases. However, you really will only have ground fault protection, and a breaker will only trip on a ground fault if it has that function available. So if you have a breaker that does not have ground fault and it experiences a ground fault, it may not trip at all. So something to consider. The mechanical trip is really just the breaker operating as it should. The shunt trip device being operated is, again, the breaker operating as it should. The breaker opens when it's commanded to by an external device, like an external ground fault relay or some other protective relay, or a remote signal to open that breaker.
So a circuit breaker would trip due to excessive amount of overcurrent through the trip unit. Once it sees that, it starts timing, and then it will trip the breaker out, or from poor maintenance of the breaker itself.